She was going to leave me first. I just left faster. We both ran. We both had our reasons. The question was whether either of us had the courage to come back properly, and whether coming back was even the right thing. I have thought about that question every single day since I packed that bag. I have turned it over in my hands the way you turn over something you found on the ground, something that looks valuable but might be broken inside. And every time I get close to an answer, I find myself back at the beginning, back at the locked door, back at the first night I stood in my own hallway with my hand raised to knock and something, instinct, fear, the ghost of my father, made me let it fall. That was where it started. Not with the pregnancy test, not with the receipt, not with the notebook I filled with 90 days of silence. It started with a locked door on a Tuesday evening in my own home, and the way Drithy's voice came through it, calm, unhurried, completely unreachable, saying, "I'll be out in a minute." I had come home earlier than usual. The logistics meeting had been cut short, a supplier had canceled, and I remember thinking on the drive home that I would surprise her, not with anything grand, just with my presence, which had started to feel, in those weeks, like something she was learning to live without. I came through the front door already loosening my tie. The house smelled like something she had cooked and left covered on the stove, which meant she had been home for hours. I called her name. Nothing. I walked down the hall to the bedroom and reached for the handle. The lock clicked from inside. I stood there with my hand still raised, and I did what I always do. I constructed a reason. She's studying. She came home exhausted. She needed to lie down and didn't want the light from the hallway. I built the reason so fast it was already finished before I took my hand down. I was good at that. I had been good at it for months without realizing it was a skill I was sharpening. She came out 7 minutes later in her robe, a medical journal tucked under her arm, and she walked past me to the kitchen like a woman with somewhere else to be inside her own mind. No kiss, no welcome home. Just the sound of the tap running and her back at the sink, filling a glass. I watched her. My wife had the kind of face that gave nothing away when she decided to give nothing away. I had loved that face for 6 years. I had studied it the way you study something you are afraid of losing, and standing in the hallway that evening, I felt, for the first time, that I was looking at it across a distance I had not been told was growing. I told myself I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. Please, before I continue, kindly like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories. I am not a man who keeps journals. I want to be clear about that because it matters. It tells you something about how far things had gone that I started keeping one. I work in hospital procurement. I manage numbers, timelines, orders. I think in columns and rows. So when the rejections started stacking up, I did the only thing that felt rational at the time. I began to track them. A small notebook. Nothing dramatic about it. The kind you buy in a pack of 3 from any stationery shop. Dates on the left, a single word on the right. No. Or sometimes just a dash, which felt worse somehow, like the question hadn't even been worth a full answer. I told myself I was not being obsessive. I told myself I just needed to see it laid out, because I was starting to doubt my own memory, starting to wonder if I was the problem in a way I couldn't identify, if I was doing something, saying something, carrying something she could sense but I couldn't name. After 30 days, I flipped back through the pages and felt the air go out of me quietly, the way it does when you've been hoping you were wrong. I tried everything I knew how to try. I bought the small yellow flowers she used to like, the ones she'd always say were unnecessary, and then put in the glass on the kitchen windowsill anyway. I cooked on my off days. I asked her once, sitting across from her at dinner, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "Is everything okay between us?" And she looked at me with those eyes, what I always called her doctor's eyes, the ones that assessed without revealing. And she said, "I've just been tired, Forenzy. Work has been intense." She was not lying. I understand that now. Work had been intense, but it was not work that was keeping her behind that locked door. It was something she was managing alone in the dark, something that required every clinical discipline she had spent years training into herself, and I was sitting across from her at dinner, seeing only the surface of it. A tired woman, a busy schedule, a marriage going through a quiet, rough patch. What I did not know, what I had no framework to understand yet, was that Drithy had already begun to grieve me. Not because I was dying, because in her mind, in the private architecture of a decision she had not yet told me she had made, we were already over. She was not withdrawing from me. She was practicing. She was preparing herself for a life I did not yet know she was planning without me. Near the end of that month, I found a page that had slipped from her journal when I picked it up to move it. One line, in her handwriting, Day 14 of protocol, progesterone levels stable. I did not know what that meant. I folded it and tucked it back. I told myself doctors write things down. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong about that too. It was a Thursday when I heard her on the phone. I came in through the back door because I had forgotten my key fob, and she was standing at the far window with her back to me, phone pressed close to her ear. I caught one sentence before she turned. Just make sure the results go directly to me, not to the general system. Dr. Okafor knows. Tell him it's a private patient file. She turned. She saw me. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, more like a doctor recalibrating to an unexpected variable. She said, I have to go, and lowered the phone. I said, busy day? She said, always. She kissed me on the cheek, the first physical contact in over a week, and walked out of the kitchen. I stood at the counter and thought about the receipt still tucked in her journal. I thought about the locked door. I thought about the notebook sitting in my work bag. I poured a glass of water and drank the whole thing standing at the sink. That night, at 1:17 a.m., I woke to sounds from the bathroom. I got up. I walked to the door. I raised my fist to knock. Then I stopped, because through the gap under the door, the light was off. She was sitting in complete darkness, completely silent, like she was waiting for something to pass. I lowered my hand. I went back to bed. I stared at the ceiling until my alarm went off. I need you to understand something about Dhrithi before I tell you the rest. She was not a cold woman. People who did not know her well sometimes mistook her stillness for coldness, but that was not what it was. She was a woman who had been raised by a mother who had survived things that required surviving to process pain inward. Her mother said it to all her daughters like scripture. A woman who cries in public has already lost. Dhrithi had absorbed that so completely it had become her default language. She did not explode. She did not confront. She diagnosed. She made a plan. She executed it quietly and completely. What I did not know during those months was that she had seen something on my phone 8 months earlier. A message from a contact she had never heard of. A message that arrived while she was borrowing my phone simply to call her mother because her own battery had died. She was not snooping. The screen lit up. She read it before she could choose not to. She stood in the kitchen for 4 minutes. The rice burned. She put the phone face down. She served the food. She smiled at dinner. She never said a word. 3 years before any of this, I had a small cyst. Benign, the doctor said, but worth monitoring, and before any procedure, he recommended I bank a sample at a fertility clinic, just as a precaution. Dhrithi was in her final year of residency. She came with me. She held my hand in the waiting room. She filled out half the paperwork because I kept stalling over the forms, too proud to admit I was frightened. The sample was stored. The surgery was minor. We laughed about it afterward over jollof rice at a small restaurant with plastic chairs and a ceiling fan that wobbled, and we never spoke of it again. I forgot about it almost completely. Not Dhrithi. 6 months before the pregnancy test, she walked into that same clinic. She used her credentials to access the records. She consulted a colleague under the guise of clinical interest and asked one careful question about consent and spousal rights. Then she read the original form 3 times. My signature was on it. Her name was listed as designated beneficiary. She had signed it too, both of us on a different afternoon in a different life. She started the hormone protocol the following Monday. She was not trying to trap me. She had already decided to leave. She simply wanted his child before she did. 6 months into her silence, she cried in the shower. I heard it from the living room, so faint I almost told myself it was the pipes. But pipes don't catch themselves mid-sound. Pipes don't press a fist to their own mouth. I put my phone down. I walked to the hallway. I sat on the floor outside the bathroom door with my back against the wall and my knees drawn up, and I listened to the sound of my wife dismantling herself in the only room in our house with a lock. It was small and controlled, and it was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever heard, because I knew, even without knowing everything, that this was not a breakdown. This was 5 minutes she had rationed herself. 5 minutes before she had to reassemble. I sat there for 20 minutes. I did not knock. I did not call her name. My father's voice was in my head, as it always was in moments like this. The throne plate, the screaming, the way confrontation had destroyed everything I called home as a child. So I sat on the floor and I made his choice in a different hallway. When the water stopped, I walked back to the living room. She came out with her face perfectly composed. She said, "You should eat. There's stew in the pot." We talked about traffic. We talked about nothing. It was an accident, the way the worst discoveries always are. Drithy's coat fell from the hook near the entrance, and I caught it before it hit the floor. As I lifted it to rehang it, something slipped from the inner pocket. A small folded receipt. Thin thermal paper. I caught it. I should have set it on the side table and kept walking. Instead, I unfolded it. The clinic name at the top read Bloom Fertility and Reproductive Health Center. Below it, a date 4 months ago, a billing code, patient initials, DC. I did not know the clinical billing codes, so I did what anyone does. I Googled the clinic. I read what they offered. IVF, IUI, embryo transfer, hormone therapy. I stood in the hallway with the receipt in one hand and my phone in the other, and I felt every quiet assumption I had made about my life begin to file out of the room. The dramatic irony, which I only understand now, looking back, is that the audience of my own life already knew the truth. I was the only one left in the dark. I refolded the receipt. I placed it exactly as it had been. I hung the coat. I went to work. At my desk, I opened the drawer, touched the notebook, and closed it again without looking inside. Something in me had stopped absorbing. I was beginning to calculate. It was a Saturday morning. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when Drithy came downstairs dressed in casual clothes, like she had somewhere to be. She placed a small white stick on the table in front of me without sitting down, without eye contact, and walked to the counter to fill her water bottle. The test was positive. 2 bold lines. I looked up at her back. She was capping the bottle, fingers precise, unhurried. I said her name. She said, "I know, just that. Not we're having a baby." Not anything a wife says when she is sharing joy. Just, "I know." Then she picked up her bag and said there was yam in the pot and she had a consult, and she walked out and the front door opened and closed and the house was silent. I sat at that table for a long time doing the only math my information allowed me to do, the receipt, the fertility clinic, the 90 days, the locked door, the phone call, the progesterone note. I laid every card I had face up on the table inside my head, and I looked at the result. I got the wrong answer, but it was the only answer available to a man working with incomplete information, and I did not know it was incomplete. I got up, I poured my coffee down the drain. I went upstairs and took a bag from the wardrobe shelf and set it on the bed. I found the couple's therapy card in my jacket pocket, the appointment I had booked and never used, and I placed it on her pillow. Then I stood over the bag for a long time before I began to pack. I did not leave that Saturday. I packed the bag and then I unpacked it. I sat on the bed for an hour. I called my brother, and when he answered, I said, "Hey, are you busy?" And he said no, and I said, "Never mind," and hung up. I needed to be sure first. I needed to eliminate every other possibility with the same discipline my wife applied to everything. Work through each option until only one remains. So I went back through it all. Her calendar against mine. The clinic receipt date against the conception window I calculated from basic research. Every date in the notebook. There was no version of the story I could construct, no version built from what I actually knew that ended with me as the father. There was no biological path. The math was clean. The math was also completely wrong. But I did not know that. I thought about calling her. I drafted a text 3 times and deleted it 3 times. I thought about waiting, sitting across the table, asking directly. Then my father's voice arrived, as it always did, carrying the memory of a kitchen and a throne plate and a childhood I spent 30 years collecting the pieces of. I closed my phone. I packed the bag again, methodically this time. Clothes, passport, documents, laptop. I left the ring on the kitchen counter beside her coffee mug, and I walked out of the house without looking back. I told myself that was dignity. It took me 6 weeks to understand it was the opposite. I stayed at my brother's apartment. He opened the door, saw the bag, and stepped aside without asking a single question. That is the only kind of love I have ever fully known how to receive. I slept for 14 hours. When I woke, there were 7 missed calls from Dhrithi, 2 from my mother, 1 from a number I didn't recognize. I turned the phone face down. In the weeks that followed, I unraveled in the specific quiet way a man unravels when he is pretending not to. I woke at 3 a.m., thinking about how she looked coming off long shifts. I picked up the phone to call her 12 times. Put it down 12 times. I bought the small yellow flowers from the market out of pure muscle memory and then stood on the street with them until an old woman passed and I gave them to her without explaining why. I sat in my brother's car one afternoon and didn't start the engine for 40 minutes. I told myself I was fine. I was not fine. I was a man who had learned the wrong lesson from a broken childhood and was now applying it to the one relationship that had deserved the better version of me. On day 41, my brother sat beside me and said quietly, "Forenzy. Her mother called my wife last night. She's been admitted." I drove 3 hours telling myself I was going as a decent human being, nothing more. I rehearsed what I would say in the car, calm, civil, a brief check, then I would leave. I parked and sat for 12 minutes. Then I went inside. 2nd floor, private room. When I appeared in the doorway, her face did something complicated. Not surprise, more like a woman who had been holding a door open for a long time and was no longer sure whether to keep holding it. She looked smaller. She also looked, despite everything, entirely like herself. She said, "You came." I said, "Your mother called." I stepped into the room and stayed near the door. I asked why she was admitted. She said, "Preeclampsia risk." They were monitoring her. We exchanged facts like 2 people who had forgotten any other language. Then she said my name, and I said don't, and she said, "You need to hear this." A nurse entered before she could continue, took readings, made notations, left. The window closed. Dhrithi turned toward the window. Outside, it was raining. My eyes moved to the fetal monitor on the screen beside her bed, the small, steady line of a heartbeat I had not expected to feel anything about. I pulled a chair to the corner of the room. I sat down. I did not leave. When the consultant stepped out to take a call, Dhrithi reached into the bedside drawer and removed a sealed envelope. She held it toward me and said, "Read it before you say a single word." Inside was a printed document from the fertility clinic. My name was on it. The original consent form, signed in both our handwriting 3 years ago in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a wobbling ceiling fan, was attached. Below it, a procedure summary, an IVF record, my sample number. I read it once. I read it again. The room was very quiet except for the monitor. The truth arrived not like a revelation, but like a correction. The quiet, devastating kind that reorganizes everything you thought you understood. The child was mine, had always been mine, built from a decision we had made together in a different season, a document we had both signed, a trust she had exercised alone because she had already begun to mourn the marriage while still loving the man inside it. I said, "You were going to leave me." She said, "Yes." I said, "But you wanted—" She said, "Your child," before I left. Yes. I asked why she never confronted me about what she had seen. She said, "Because I'm not my father." I understood that completely. I reached into my pocket. I had nothing to give her. Then she opened the drawer again and showed me the therapy appointment card, worn at the edges, folded and unfolded more times than I could count. She had kept it. I looked at it for a long time. Then I covered her hand with mine and the monitor beeped, steady and small, and outside it kept raining.